Hello, and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be doing the end of year book tag, which was created by Kira the Scrivener. I've seen a bunch of other people on BookTube doing it over the last few months, and I decided I should also like to do it myself before we get too far into the new year. So, question number 1. How did you feel about reading this year? You can choose an adjective or expand. I read mostly nonfiction, which is a habit I've gotten into over the last 5 or 10 years, if I'm remembering correctly. I'm long overdue to resume reading more fiction, particularly since there are still so many classics I need to become acquainted with that I didn't have the chance to read in school. And for a while I was very seriously, studiously, making up for all these books I never got a chance to read in junior high, high school, or community college or university in the early years after I graduated, and particularly when I couldn't walk for 11 months after the car accident I had. I had much free time to do a lot of reading, but unfortunately over the years it's just fallen by the wayside, and I've begun reading more nonfiction than fiction. And to my great regret, I've also begun reading more like a writer than a reader, which means I more frequently DNF fiction and constantly pick apart everything that's technically wrong with it instead of focusing more on the actual story and characters. Like, for example, why are you spending all this time introducing like 30 plus minor characters in the first chapter, and we're never going to see them again after page 40, or like opening with 20, 30 pages of backstory info dump about the family's entire history. You're just starting in one place, and then 3 pages later it's a long detailed flashback. Like, why didn't you just start there in the first place if it's that important to the story? Or just like so many other things, and particularly in older fiction, which I obviously do understand they had much different sensibilities and writing rules in those days that we don't operate under these days, and it was never really something I minded in the old days before I began writing more towards serious publication, instead of just I knew I was going to be published someday, but it just wasn't something I thought of the technical side. But unfortunately that's something that has made me see fiction a lot differently, and I know that's a habit and a mindset I need to get out of and stop being so much in my own head and just read fiction for pleasure again the way I used to. And I would love to get back to reading the way I used to read before I became so serious about writing for publication and adapting my old-fashioned writing style for more contemporary sensibilities. And like I mentioned, that's unfortunately taken so much joy out of the reading I used to have for fiction in particular, because I love old books. That was how I learned to write. And now when you get to a certain point and you realize, oh, people aren't writing like that anymore, or people will make fun of you, or that would get an instant rejection from the agent or whatever. And unfortunately that's, well, I know I'm rambling, that's just, I want to get out of that mindset and go back more towards fiction pleasure reading. And number 2, what are 2 phases authors you went through this year? Well, as I've mentioned on my blog, I haven't been mentioning so much on videos here, but I did review a few of the books. I read almost all of Maud Hart Lovelace's books. I don't know if a lot of people now are familiar with her, apart from really devoted fans. She wrote the Betsy-Tacy series, which is very, very, very strongly based on her own life and her own hometown, to the point sometimes it just feels very thinly fictionalized. She's just changing the names and a few minor details here and there, with a few notable exceptions. And so this is the series. These are the first 4 books, which take place when Betsy ages from 4 to 12, and these are the first 2 high school books when she's a freshwoman and a sophomore, and these are when she's an upperclasswoman in high school. She's a junior and a senior. And I have to mention there's a very depressing memento I put in the pages of this book somewhere. My first gray hair, if you look very closely, you can see I do have a few gray hairs starting to sprout now, but I don't really care, since I almost died when I was 23. I would rather have evidence I'm getting older than not get older at all. And this is the last one. I'm really looking forward to finally reading the final book in the series, Betsy's Wedding, and I'll be rereading it in full after I finally finish the last book. And also she wrote a few spin-off books set in the same fictionalized version of her hometown, which she calls Deep Valley, and the characters from the Betsy-Tacy series also appear in these books, though they're not the main characters, although they have the most prominent roles in these 2 books. And my favorite Maud Hart Lovelace book was Carney's House Party, which is I loved it. I just read it in one single Shabbos, the Sabbath, and it was just really, really that good. And this was my second favorite, and although it wasn't my favorite, only my second favorite, Emily was my favorite of Mrs. Lovelace's characters. I just related to her and her life situation much better than the characters in the rest of their books. As I've mentioned, I have nothing against, the characters of the author or the stories or anything like that. It's just because they have like such comfortable upper middle class lives, and they care so much about like popularity and boys and social life in high school instead of like being serious, quiet introverts like I was, who like didn't give a fig about like social life or like dating or any of that nonsense. It's harder for me to relate to like Betsy and her friends, and easier to relate to Emily, who's more quiet and serious, studious. So I am really looking forward to rereading the series in full. And also, if you've been reading my blog or watching some of my videos, I also did my first full reread of The Divine Comedy for the first time since I read it in very, very late 2003, so I believe I finished it around March 2004. The reason I had dipped in and out of it again many times over the years, but not done a full reread, because I just didn't have a very good modern translation. I really was not looking forward to trying to like wade through again the Elizabethan English, like trying to make Dante sound like Shakespeare, as I've spoken about before. And when I was moved to the area I'm in now in the summer of 2017, I luckily found the Mark Musa translation at the used bookstore, Mr. K's, which has in several areas throughout the U.S. South. It was for $10, and I also found the Longfellow translation in hardcover. I got it for mostly the Gustave Doré famous woodcut illustrations, and then since then, obviously, you can see I've added several other translations to my collection, including a separate standalone volume of La Vita Nuova, translated by Mark Musa, and it's also in the other translation I have by him. The previous version I read was in the Portable Dante, which, in addition to his magnum opus and La Vita Nuova, also contains excerpts of several of his other works, and that version of La Vita Nuova was translated by Dante Gabriel Rossetti. And so obviously you can look forward to some more Dantean content from me in the coming year too, both here on the vlog and on my blog. And number 3, what is the book you regret not reading? The Tale of Genji by Lady Murasaki. I had it out from the library, but for whatever reason I didn't get around to reading it, and I know we read some excerpts from it when I was taking a Japanese history class my senior year of university. We had to take at least one course in Asian history as part of the requirements for being a history major. I absolutely loved that class. I've been a Nipponophile since I was 14 years old. I love Japanese culture and history and language and literature. I would love to write some Japanese historical someday, and I did, as I mentioned in a previous video. I wrote a short story set in Nara era Japan in the year 737 for a short story contest a few years ago, and I really enjoyed it. I just love everything about, Japan, Japanese culture. I would love to get more immersed into Asian literature, because I have read some things and aware of some major books and such, but like particularly in the Far East, I'm not as familiar with that literature as I am from Europe and the United States. Obviously a lot of people have that big gap in their like reading like canon, and that's something I really am very serious about wanting to fill more and more. Now, number 4. What is something you learned from reading this year? Well, I gradually resumed my long-lost habit of taking time to read for several hours at a time, though it wasn't always easy after becoming more used to reading in short bursts and spending more time writing and editing than reading. And that's kind of like a double-edged sword when you become more serious about like being a writer and writing towards publication, still just thinking, oh, it'll happen someday, or I don't need to change my writing style or get serious about improving the technical side of my writing skills. So you obviously need to spend more time like writing and editing your own work, and you don't always necessarily have as much time for like reading as you used to. But obviously on Shabbos, the Sabbath, I never use my computer, so I have much more time to read. And unfortunately I never became Shomeret Yom Tov, a guardian of the holidays, for like reasons too long to get into here. But basically I was unfortunately never found a husband or had children, and I don't live in a really big Jewish community, so it's just much harder to do that, and I didn't want to add like one more thing that felt like a burden and a difficulty for me. It's already difficult enough being Shomeret Shabbat, guardian of the Sabbath, when I am not in my own home and away from like a real like vibrant Jewish community. Anyway, long story short. And I also learned about the importance of serious outside study for complex works, even if that means I might need to read slower and more carefully. Like particularly when I was rereading the Divine Comedy, I get a lot of good things from like YouTube channels and like books and website resources, like the kinds of things that were absolutely not available at all when I was first reading it. And there were so many, layers and details and just things I genuinely wasn't aware of that the first time around when I was reading it, or even when I was like trying to supplement my knowledge a little bit in a few books and things I read afterwards. And I do have a future video plan based on my blog post about like sources for extra textual study of the Divine Comedy, and I hope to, pick up a few more possibly like YouTube channels and websites and such to add to that list. So that's why I haven't made the video yet. I want to have an even bigger list of resources than I originally listed in my blog post. And number 5, what is a book you wish you talked about more? I mentioned this in my a recent video on Fragments of Isabella, Saving the Fragments, and the combination of the two books simply called Isabella by Isabella Leitner. Her maiden name was Katz. She was one of 8 children born in Kisvárda, Hungary. She survived the Holocaust, and it's just like this very, very powerful memoir. And it's not like your typical Holocaust memoir. There are no, like detailed chapters. They're kind of almost like, I wouldn't say like free writes, just sort of like very like fragmented little bits and like stream of consciousness, sort of just, things that she was thinking about, or like little anecdotes that happened along the way. There were no, like, not really many like graphic details or anything like that. It's not the purpose of the book at all. It's just, a story of the love between these 4 sisters who survived for one another, because of one another, and it's had a very great, influence on my own life, and also like has inspired some of my own historical fiction I've written about the Holocaust, including the successful death march escape Isabella and her sisters had in January 1945. They ran into an abandoned house, and it was Eastern Germany at the time. Now it's, I believe, part of Poland, and because the sister who engineered the escape realized it was abandoned because there's no smoke coming out of the chimney, and this is, Europe's most brutal winter in at least like 20 years or more. So obviously, if people were in the house, they would have been like running that chimney overtime, and just so many interesting, things they like went through on their way, back to the land of the living. And when they're in the United States, they were the first Auschwitz survivors to come to the U.S. after the war. They arrived on VE Day because their father had come to the United States in 1939. He was a wine salesman, and he had some, people who pulled some connections so he could come back to the U.S. And sadly, he was never able to get visas for his family back in Hungary in time. First, he tried to come to the U.S., and they did, but then Pearl Harbor was bombed, and that was impossible. And then he wanted to get them visas for pre-state Israel, and that also came through, but unfortunately, like, Hungary was invaded like around that same time, and those like visas were basically as good as toilet paper, and they were basically stuck. And there's some new things as well in the combined volume about Isabella's life when she gets older, and just some like really like powerful like things like about what trauma does to the brain, and you never really get over something like that. This isn't some like happy sunny memoir all about, and my life was like perfect and beautiful after the first few years of trauma. This like really affected Isabella's mind, and particularly her youngest surviving sister, Regina. It's just like a really, powerful thing you should read. And also because it was written in first person present tense. I had read some books written in third person present tense, not very many. This was way before it exploded in popularity and became so freaking trendy, but it's like, because Isabella's book is written in first-person present tense, I came to feel that's, a perfect, like, tense for writing a Showa memoir, because you're, like, right there immediately is all this, like, frightening, like, traumatic, like, soul-changing stuff is going on. And so that's one of the few times I feel like first-person present tense is perfect instead of an annoying, like, trend, like, all this, like, YA contemporary, why do YA? Gotta do first-person present tense no matter what. Number 6. What is a non-bookish highlight? Movie, show, song, podcast, etc. Well, this was a really big surprise to me. I wasn't expecting to like this show at all. I really got into the reboot of The Wonder Years on ABC. It's on 8:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on Wednesday nights. I was very skeptical at first because I really don't like reboots. I mean, obviously, I thought the concept was great. A black family living in Alabama in the late 1960s as the youngest child, a boy, comes of age. But I thought, why can't they just call it something besides The Wonder Years if it's such a, distinct concept that's kind of lazy piggybacking, but no, it's emerged as like it's entirely its own story. It's not some like cheap, lazy play-by-play of the original, just substituting a black family for a white family. It's a really, really good show. I would highly recommend you guys to check it out. And it was because I was watching this show, I saw on the commercials another show ABC just recently had in for 3 weeks in January. Unfortunately, it was a limited time series, but you can still stream it on Hulu. There were 2 episodes every night, so for a total of 6 episodes, called Women of the Movement, based on the true tragic but like ultimately inspiring story of Mamie Till Mobley, the mother of Emmett Till. This is like really, really powerful television, and particularly the final episode. I wasn't expecting them to actually show the brutal, like tragic, horrific lynching scene. So obviously it's not something you watch like for lighthearted fun and entertainment. It's like really, really important, powerful television. And another non-bookish highlight, if you follow me on Instagram, you've seen all my many photos over the last few years of my feline friends. I help with taking care of several local cats. Some of them have owners and they just like wander around all day, which I think is kind of animal abuse. Keep your animal inside, like particularly could get, like, God forbid, run over by a car or attacked by another animal or killed by a nasty human. But I do help with feeding and taking care of these cats. Like most of them are very tame. They let you pet them and play with them. They'll come right up to you. But there's one really, really special kitty. He's a tuxedo cat. We've called him White Shoes. He was so feral and frightened of humans when he first showed up. He would like run, and you could like hear his paws like pounding against the grass when a human got like more than like closer than 10 feet to him. And gradually over time he became more guardedly trusting of humans getting closer to him. And now he like actually he can run to me for food sometimes when he's really hungry. I'll go outside and meow, and he'll like meow back and like run down the hills. Like he'll run to me for food, and he'll get within like an inch or two of my hand as I'm putting the food out for him. And he even comes into the lanai, the like screened in like porch thing. We call it a lanai in the South, although I'm not a native Southerner. And he'll like come in there like for a more sheltered experience while he's eating, although unfortunately he doesn't stick around too long. I just love this cat so much, and I'm waiting very patiently for him to make first contact and rub against my leg. God willing, someday soon he'll want to be petted, and I would love to take him to Israel with me when I make Aliyah. I follow a woman on Instagram named Gail. She's originally from South Africa. When she moved to Israel, she took 29 feral cats with her, and her whole life now is like having a cat shelter and taking care of neighborhood cats and feeding them. Unfortunately, there are millions of feral cats in Israel and all across other places in the Mediterranean because like the British colonists imported them to cure a rat problem in the 30s, and never like took care of the cats afterwards. They just let them roam free and keep breeding. But I absolutely love my kitties, and I'm really looking forward to someday hopefully having a cat of my own and not just taking care of the neighborhood cats. And number 7, what is the greatest outlier in your books? Well, I bought these, I believe it was in the summer of 2017. I went to a book signing at an indie bookstore in the area where I currently live. YA contemporary is not my thing at all, but I went there because the woman who wrote this book, Katy Upperman, we were blogging friends for a while. We didn't have a falling out or anything. It's just she doesn't blog so often anymore, and the blog hop we had met through and participated in for many years on What's Up Wednesday, it like kind of went under because the women running it decided to focus more on their writing and such. It was the questions, what I'm writing this week, what I'm reading this week, what else is up with me. There might have been another question or two, and I really liked Katy. She was always fun and friendly, even though like her genre and the like point of view and tense she writes are completely different from mine. I write serious historical fiction in the third person past tense 99% of the time, but I really felt it was nice to come out and support her, particularly since this was her debut novel. And I spoke to her and the other author afterwards, and they signed both of the books for me, so it was really nice to meet them, even if it's not my style at all. Always help out your friends in the writing community, even if you're not like 100% in alignment on the kinds of things you write, because that'll come back to you like very like threefold, like whatever good energy you put out, like obviously comes back to you. Number 8, what book are you most excited to revisit? Well, as I've mentioned many times, if I can get to 100 subscribers, I will be doing a planned 105 video series on the Decameron by Giovanni Boccaccio. This is one of my favoriteest books of all time. I first heard a story from it in my sophomore year of high school. One of the girls in my class did a presentation on it and read one of the stories about it, about this Federico degli Alberighi. He loves but is not beloved, and the woman he loves marries another man, and he wastes all his money in trying to court her, and like he's basically left with just regular hunting falcon. And like one summer she comes to visit after she's been widowed, and he like tries to entertain her and like win her again. Then God forbid her little boy becomes very sick and says, the thing I most want is Federico's falcon. And the lady comes to visit to ask for the falcon, and Federico is so excited he has the falcon killed to like serve his lady like a meal that's worth something, like worthy of a great lady such as herself. And after they've eaten, she makes the request and says, "Oh, I'm so sorry, I can't do this." And he shows her the bones to prove it, and she like really starts like ripping him apart. How can you do this? And but she goes on her way, and then sadly the boy dies. And then her like brothers like encourage her, you're like I guess in early 20s, I would assume. They generally got married very young in that era, and they're telling her, you're too young to stay a widow forever and not have any other children after you lost your first child. Get married already, pick a new husband. And she says, "Oh, brothers, I would remain a widow if it's what you would want of me, but if you insist I take a new husband, I would take no other man than Federico degli Alberighi." And they start laughing at her and saying, "You foolish woman, what are you saying? He hasn't a penny to his name." And she says, "My brothers, this is very true, but I would rather marry a man in need of money than money in need of a man." And once Federico finds himself the husband of such a great lady, he manages his money much more carefully than he has in the past, and becomes rich and just learns better lessons about taking care of his finances. And so I absolutely love this book. There are only about 7 stories I can think of that haven't aged well or that I never really liked, mostly the ones involving like domestic abuse and some other like just things that are horrifying to modern readers, and more than just oh, that's just how things were way. But I'm really looking forward to doing this series when I can get up to 100 subscribers. And obviously that wouldn't just be 100, it would be like people actively engaging with me, because you can have 100 subscribers, but if like only like 5 or 10 of those people are like regularly watching the videos and commenting, it just doesn't seem like it would be worth the effort. Number 9, what video are you most proud of? My, obviously the recitation video I did on Dante's 700th yahrzeit death anniversary on September 14th. I recited Canto of Inferno in the original medieval Florentine Tuscan Italian. I still can't believe I actually did that, and that I can still remember all 136 lines perfectly. It takes about 7 minutes to recite. I spent around 4 months learning the lines, and then 2 additional months, perfecting them to make sure I knew it perfectly. And I've mentioned in the previous earlier videos I did, the process I had to like memorize the lines, and how I got them down cold constantly, saying them over and over again, like things I listened to, actually other recitations of it, and like reciting them at the pool when I was alone waiting for my sunscreen to dry. And it's just, I still can't believe I did that. And I was starting to memorize Canto 2 in Italian, but I only got 45 lines, and I just thought, just focus on getting the first canto, just knowing it cold before like adding something else that you don't really need to do for this big video you're planning. And I will, hopefully, God willing, get back to that soon. In like, my idealistic dreams, I would love to memorize the entire poem, but we'll just see, how far I can get, because, that's really something, a big challenge I would like to set for myself, and see just, how many cantos I can learn. Number 10. What is your favorite last line of a book? Well, there are several. Obviously, I love the final lines of the Divine Comedy in the Lawrence Binion translation. Before lockdown, I would always go out and look at the stars at night. Unfortunately, I haven't seen them outside since lockdown began in March 2020, but I always say to myself the last lines: "To the high force imagination now failed, but like to a wheel whose circling nothing jars, already on my desire and will prevailed, the love that moves the sun and the other stars." And these other 2 lines I really like. One is from November 1916, which was the second book in the 4-book Red Wheel cycle by my favorite writer, Aleksandr Isayevich Solzhenitsyn. It's a very difficult book to read because, like, it's really, really ambitious, this whole thing. It's not because of the length, it's because the narrative is routinely interrupted by, like, let's just call them what they are. They're like basically like research papers masquerading as part of the actual story. Like, I mean, the Duma transcripts might seem like that too, but at least they're, you can understand why they're there, and they contribute to what's going on. He's basically, many times they're just like, oh, all these like facts and figures about what was going on at the time. That's kind of boring. It contributes absolutely nothing. It's kind of just showing off your research, but it really was worth it to slog through all those pointless like chapters of clutter to get to the beautiful final lines. I'm not going to like give like too much away, but there's this young lady, a teenage girl named Xena, and she's had a child out of wedlock, and some tragedies have happened to her, and she's totally like sad and low, and she's gone to a priest, a Russian Orthodox priest, for confession, and he tells her these beautiful lines at the end. You can rarely decide for another, and he or she should not do this or that. How can anyone forbid you to love when Christ said that there is nothing higher than love, and he made no exceptions for love of any kind whatsoever? And I've frequently given that line, or like variations within it, to my characters, particularly my characters who are also Russian Orthodox themselves. I just think that's a really beautiful sentiment. Even though I'm Jewish and not Christian, we can always find like wisdom and inspiration in other faiths ourselves, because interfaith dialogue and friendship and understanding can go a long way towards a more beautiful, perfect world, and erasing the ugly things in the past that were dividing us when we didn't know anything about our neighbors, and we just basically our own frame of reference was like what we knew, and we didn't like care to know about anything else besides that. And also from The Painted Bird by Jerzy Kosinski, I read this book, and I believe it was very late 1999, possibly very early 2000. I remember I got a used paperback of it from a used bookstore in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, in the Berkshires, where I was living at the time, and my parents like couldn't believe I was reading that book. Oh, why would you want to read something so mean-spirited and sad? Yeah, because I gravitated towards depressing, dark periods of history and like dark parts of the human spirit. I'm kind of bored by stories that are all like flowers and puppies and glitter and kittens and things like that. It's not like I revel in like bad parts of history. It's just, I guess it speaks to me more strongly. And as I've mentioned, the first book I ever read was Grimm's Fairy Tales, the adult uncensored version. I was 3 years old, obviously not nearly all the way through at that age, but it just had a big impact in my subconscious and the things I prefer to read and write about. And this is one of the most powerful books I've ever read. I still remember it in like graphic detail so many years later, all these like horrible, like awful things that happened, but they just have never left my brain. They're that unforgettable. The voice lost in a faraway village church had found me again and filled the whole room. I spoke loudly and incessantly like the peasants, and then like the city folk, as fast as I could, enraptured by the sounds that were heavy with meaning, as wet snow is heavy with water, convincing myself again and again and again that speech was now mine, and that it did not intend to escape through the door, which opened onto the balcony. This is just like so powerful. This boy becomes a psychosomatic mute about halfway through the book. These very like angry, like mean-spirited peasants, they dunk him in a latrine during the festival of Corpus Christi, and he barely escapes them. And then when he's like finally alone in the woods, he realizes he can't speak anymore, no matter how much he tries, and he spends the rest of World War II like being unable to speak. And it's just like a really like powerful book about the human spirit, what they can survive despite all this like gross like grime and cruelty around you. And a bonus, number 11. Is there a creator or video you'd like to shout out? Well, these aren't related to BookTube or AuthorTube at all. One, well, actually the two, they're related. Saskia from Los Angeles Guinea Pig Rescue and Scotty's Animals. Scotty has been a volunteer with the LA Guinea Pig Rescue for over 10 years, and Saskia is the founder. I believe she started it in 1999. She's originally from the Netherlands, and they do so much wonderful work with all these dear little sweet piggies. They've like taken in like hoarding cases, thousands and thousands over the years, and people who just like cowardly dump them in the middle of the night. Well, they're not in LA proper, but they're like somewhere near in the vicinity. So they're basically out in the desert, and it can get really cold out there at night, particularly in the winter, and there are like predators like coyotes and hawks, and if they smell the piggies, they can like get into the box or the carriers and kill these poor little animals. These like cowards just like dumped on their door instead of taking to the animal shelter, and they just do so much wonderful work for these piggies. And they say there have been people who like drive more than 8 hours to come and adopt a piggy, and if I ever go to the West Coast, I would well, obviously I would want to go to LA to like visit all the famous people from the golden age of Hollywood in their cemeteries, but I would also love to go there to adopt some piggies. They never adopt single piggies out unless you're like coming with your own piggy and want a buddy for him or her, because they're herd animals, social animals, and they'll suffer if they don't have at least one of their own kind, so they'll do play dates so they can make sure your piggy has a buddy. And it's just something really important and special, and people who love animals, particularly some of God's tiniest little creatures, not just like, you know, the dogs, cats, and horses and things like that. They're very, very special people, and they have such big hearts. They just seem so lovely and wonderful and genuine. So if you love piggies, and even if you don't live anywhere near LA, like I encourage you to, if you want and have the, you know, the time and the money, go out and visit them and adopt a piggy, because it's just such wonderful, wonderful work they do. I can't say enough about them. And also one I discovered fairly recently, but it's similar to some other channels I follow, called Life in the 1800s. They're like video recordings. Sometimes they're colorized, like not video recordings, actual, you know, films of people speaking who were born in the 19th century. Like, for example, a woman born in 1835, and she was like 95, 94 years old at the time, and like talking about her life in these eras that are now history. And they're like basically talking about like how life was in those days. Like, for example, you could begin working at 14 with no experience and like quickly rise to become, you know, the head of the company by the time you were 25, and have a great life and retire very comfortably. Just things we don't understand, or that's not part of our wheelhouse anymore, and it's kind of haunting. They say like, hi y'all, like I'm so glad to talk to you, and this is, you know, a person who was born like, who has probably been like dead longer than she's been alive now. It's just, you know, greeting you from the past. And when you think about like who was the oldest person in that person's lifetime, and you know, who was the oldest person in that person's lifetime, so it's just like never ending, completely unbroken, beautiful chain to the past. The past is never really as far away as we believe it is. And also I really like Piercing with Scott. This is a piercer who works in Las Vegas. He seems so like fun and genuine. I would love to go get pierced by him if I'm ever in Las Vegas. He's just, you know, so knowledgeable. He does a weekly live chat where you can talk about, ask your problems and questions and such, or just, you know, make comments. He's just such a wonderful, lovely person, and I'm so glad that in general the public perception of like body piercings and tattoos has come a long way since the last 20 years or so. It's, you know, so mainstream now. Most decent normal people no longer like blink an eye at multiple ear piercings, or even like a nostril stud like I have, and even the septum piercing has become quite mainstream, particularly since they now have so many more jewelry options, not just the so-called like bull ring, this plain like circular barbell with the two like little dots, the balls on the end, and just other things. As there's, you know, more, much greater options and prettier things for jewelry. And like when they see, oh, people with piercings now, like many of them are over the age of 30, and they're like, you know, serious and professional. They're not just, you know, like scene kids or like drugged out rebels. They're like actual like serious people with like, you know, lives and careers and families. You know, you can't stereotype us all, and hopefully I will be getting many more ear piercings in future. And I also like to get my other nostril pierced in the septum, and I'm also thinking of like double high nostrils as well. And so that's just, you know, something I've loved, the art and the culture and the history of body modification since pretty much my whole life. So like I highly encourage you guys to check out those channels if those are things you're at all interested in. I'll leave links below in the description box. And my next video will be sometime this week. Not quite sure what the topic will be yet. Possibly one of my Dantean posts. So thank you very much for listening to the end. Please consider liking, commenting, subscribing, and sharing, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss notifications when I post a new video. I'm looking forward to growing my channel a lot in the coming year, particularly as my technical skills improve about like filming and camera angles and lighting and such. So thank you very much for listening and supporting my channel. See you very soon. Thanks. Bye.